The Dark Ages were a heinous time to live through, and there's a lot of elements from that period I think folks wish could be erased from history. There's the obvious death and pestilence, but also some of the more tumultuous stuff people got put through and more, so let's acknowledge it so we don't risk repeating it. What would the Dark Ages be without crazy amounts of mass killing? Sadly to say. Although nowadays it's more common to place this in the field of late antiquity, one could say that the Nika riots in 532 AD of the Eastern Roman Empire count as such. The rundown is that two competing chariot racing teams became so hostile that killings of opposing fans began occurring, and after a long period of time things boiled over and riots erupted in the city of Constantinople. Justinian immediately quelled the riot and cornered the remaining rioters in the Hippodrome, the massive chariot racing stadium, before killing all of them. It is said that tens of thousands of deaths occurred from this. Later on, one finds another example in Charlemagne's wiping out of the Saxons during his campaign in Upper Germany, in which he ordered the deaths of some 4,000 Germanic tribesmen after he forced them to convert to Christianity on penalty of death. Apart from the conquering of cities and the assumed looting that would most likely have happened, there's a couple more examples to be found for a few hundred more years. In the 1180s, the Eastern Roman Empire had become fairly hostile due to the intents of Western nations due to centuries of frustration with the West, religious division, interference with trade routes, and general lack of goodwill towards each other. This culminated in the mass killing of the Latins under the reign of Emperor Andronicos Komnenos, in which the largely Eastern Orthodox population went on a vengeful killing spree of the Genoese and Venetian merchants, whom they felt had been stealing profits and jobs at the expense of the local citizens. This strongly lowered relations between the Empire and Catholic Europe. In good part as a response to this mass kill spree, when the next, and at this point the Fourth Crusade was called in 1204, soldiers passing through Constantinople had the realization that they were in the middle of a country filled with excommunicated people, believers in what they saw as a corrupted faith, who had just killed the vast majority of Catholic inhabitants in its capital city within less than a generation from the current age. And thus the Fourth Crusade has gone down in infamy due to the wholesale destruction of a city they were not meant to destroy, the killing of its people and the theft of its treasures. Further along in the same century, we have the sack of Baghdad by the forces of the Mongols, in which the capital of Abbasid Caliphate was utterly destroyed, shifting its importance from the most prosperous city in the east to a far more minor settlement, sadly. If we wanted to name all the plagues and pestilence hell from the Dark Ages, we'd be here forever. So I do recommend checking out some of the other videos we've done on that, but it's worth highlighting a couple of standouts. For starters, the dancing plague of 1518, or the dance epidemic of that time, was a case of dancing mania that occurred in what is now known as France, from July until September of 1518. So the outbreak began when a woman by the name of Frau Tolfea began to dance fervently in a street for a week straight. Soon, 3 dozen others joined in on the dancing chaos, with the plague claiming about 400 victims by August. By early September, it began to subside, and all the dancers were sent to a mountain shrine to pray for absolution. Now, we're not quite sure how many, but a couple of folks did actually pass from this, which is pretty wild. Historical documents, including physician notes, cathedral sermons, local and regional chronicles, and even notes issued by the city council, are kind of clear that it's like, okay, it happened, but nobody knows how. There's a couple of theories, a lot. The most popular being stress-induced mass hysteria. Other theories include ergot poisoning, which is a whole can of worms, and religious stuff. In the medical writings of Europe throughout the Dark Ages and well into the Industrial Age, tuberculosis was a big one, also known as the White Plague or consumption, all in reference to the progressive wasting of the victim's health and vitality as the disease took its course. The cause, way back in the Dark Ages, was assumed to be mainly constitutional, either the result of an inherited disposition or of unhealthy or dissolute living. Then you've also got the infamous Black Death. Almost half the population of Britain died of it, and that's like 1.5 million people. Whole freaking villages were wiped out by the disease. And if you were there, you fled. In a lot of villages, there was nobody left to take care of the fields, and then you get famine, which will either kill you or drive you out. Oh, we can't forget the pox. That was a pretty common ailment as well, probably one of the most common of all. Speaking of famine, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was the first of a series of large-scale crises that struck parts of Europe early in the 14th century. Most of Europe, extending east to Poland and south to the Alps, was affected. This caused many deaths over an extended period of years and marked a clear end to the period of growth and prosperity from the 11th to the 13th centuries. Now this all started with bad weather in the spring of 1315. Crop failures lasted through 1316 until summer harvest in 1317, and Europe didn't fully recover recover until 1322. Crop failures were not the only problem. Cattle disease caused sheep and cattle numbers to fall as much as 80%, and famines became familiar occurrences in a lot of Dark Ages Europe. For example, localized famines occurred in the Kingdom of France during 1304, 1305, 1310, the Great Famine, 1330 to 34, 1349 to 51, 1390. Yeah, there's a lot more. In the Kingdom of England, the most prosperous kingdom affected by the big one, well, then we had a lot more famines, 1321, 1351, 1369. For a lot of people, there just wasn't enough to eat, so life was a relatively short and brutal struggle to survive. According to official records about the English royal family, an example of the most well-off in society, and they actually kept records about them, the average life expectancy at birth in 1276 was like 35 years. Between 1301 to 1325, and during the Great Famine, it was 29 years. And then between 1348 to 1375, it was only 17 years, which shows the steep population drop between 1348 to 1375 of about 42%. The history of coitus-related acts is a straightforward one. For centuries, the people of the Christian West lived in a state of repression, straitjacketed by an overwhelming fear of sin combined with a lack of knowledge about their own bodies. Those who fell short of the high moral standards that church, state, and society demanded of them faced ostracism and punishment. Intercourse-related acts meant for pleasure and not for procreation were considered a big sin, punishable by life in prison. So was any form of female domination over a man, meaning women could not go on top. One saint in particular, Francesca Romana, was forced into marriage, and she was so scared of experiencing pleasure, she burned her own genitalia with hot fat to make the act as miserable as possible. The case of the French cleric Arnaud de Verneuil illustrates pretty well a man's point of view at the time. So one day, early 14th century, when he was a student, he had intercourse with a professional. Several years later, he confessed this lapse to the Inquisition, explaining that, at the time they were burning the lepers, I was living in Toulouse. One day I did it with a lady of the night, and after I had perpetrated this sin, my face began to swell. I was terrified and thought I had caught leprosy. I thereupon swore in the future that I would never sleep with a woman again. Now, Arnaud's tale is not unusual. Many men found themselves with undesirable symptoms after a brothel visit, and attributed their plight to their naughty behavior. Among the various medical miracles attributed to St. Thomas Becket, for example, was the cure of Odo de Beaumont, who became leprous immediately after a late 12th century visit to an intercourse worker. Much has been made of the Dark Ages' tendency to interpret disease as a product of sin. King Henry VII suffered from a sleeping sickness that remains mysterious to this day. So after a sudden fright, he fell into a catatonic state for a year and a half. Whenever he'd wake up, he was reportedly very young, behavior-like, and agreeable, but he couldn't recognize people. And he continued to slip into catatonia periodically for the rest of his life. Some historians believe he was suffering from catatonic schizophrenia, a condition characterized by symptoms including stupor, catalepsy, and mutism. And other folks think it was just a mental breakdown. If I have anything interesting to say about how folks were punished and tormented during the Dark Age, yeah, you kind of have to hand it to the people of the time for being very creative about how they performed heinous acts. So some criminals, traitors, and a lot of innocent men were killed using standard methods, like one resembling the slicing of the head, which was kind of painless and quick. Other ways were brutal and inhumane, like drawing and quartering, a punishment for high treason. So in this process, the criminal would be dragged along the ground by a horse to where they were to have their life ended. They would then meet the rope necklace, close to death, but not completely to death, and then they would be chopped into 4 pieces or quartered. And then there's other things that I can't talk about. The use of Greek fire was a crazy incendiary chemical weapon manufactured in and used by the Eastern Roman Empire from the 7th through the 14th centuries. The recipe for said fire was a closely guarded state secret, but historians speculate it may have been made by combining pine resin, quicklime, calcium phosphide, sulfur, and some other couple of things. Roman sailors would toss devices loaded with Greek fire onto enemy ships or spray it from tubes. Its ability to burn on water made it an effective and destructive naval incendiary weapon. To this day, we still don't have the official recipe. A book from 1086 tells us that about 74% of the population of the English countryside was not free. Serfs, cotters, boarders, owned servants were all bound in serving to a lord for life, and they needed his permission for every major decision, even if they wanted to get married. The dominance of the Catholic Church during the Dark Ages played a significant role in shaping society. Monasteries became centers of learning and knowledge preservation, contributing to the eventual revival of education and culture. However, the Church's influence also led to limited intellectual exploration. For example, Crusaders famously sacked Jerusalem, but even Christian cities weren't always safe from their attacks. In 1204, the armies of the Fourth Crusade entered Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and a major Christian center, which unfortunately didn't protect the inhabitants from losing their lives, practicing their religion the quote-unquote wrong way. And finally for today, the collapse of the Roman Empire led to a power vacuum, resulting in the fragmentation of territories and the rise of smaller kingdoms and feudal systems. This often meant local rulers had limited control and security was compromised. Well, that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.